Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Mr. Miller, for that incredible presentation. Hopefully my presentation will maybe start to hint at some ideas for answers to some of the discussion that we've been having. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about some efforts that have been taking place over the past several years. This was originally supposed to be a 2-year update, but it's now become a 5-more-year update on an effort known as to boldly preserve, and some of the work that's going on looking at preserving the future of space history. So it kind of pulls your brain in both directions. So a bit about me and where I'm coming from. I am the space curator for the Museum of Flight, and if you're not familiar, we are located in Seattle, Washington, on Boeing Field, just south of downtown Seattle. And we are an American Alliance of Museums accredited institution. We're a 501c3 nonprofit and a Smithsonian affiliate. And we are the largest, or we at least, I don't know how much we've done to really prove this, but we say we are the largest non-governmental air and space museum in the world. Prior to COVID, we were getting over 600,000 visitors annually. Those numbers have dropped significantly, but they are climbing back up towards that baseline. And we are currently over 450,000 square feet of display space spread across 2 sides of a major thoroughfare on Boeing Field. And we really began engaging with this question of how do we preserve and communicate the future of spaceflight in 2011 when the space shuttles retired. We were part of the bidding process to get a shuttle orbiter. We ended up getting the shuttle full fuselage trainer, which you see there is the centerpiece of our Charles Simonyi Space Gallery, which tells the shuttle story. And that was originally the centerpiece of the space vehicle mock-up facility, Building 9 down at Johnson Space Center. And our CEO at the time had connections with the X Prize Foundation and really encouraged us to not just tell the shuttle story, but also to look forward and look at what's coming next and to try to tell that story. So we were operating independently over several years trying to wrap our heads around this. And then in 2018, we hooked up with an independent effort that was going on to do a similar thing called the To Boldly Preserve Project. And they had a conference, which we'll hear more about from Jonathan Coopersmith later today, which brought together 90 space history professionals from across the country at the American Institute of Physics in College Park, Maryland, to figure out how to encourage space actors to collect and preserve the history that is going on now. And we had great representation from a lot of the cultural preservation community, independent historians, museums, NASA centers, etc., as well as some representatives from government, but we did not have the voice of industry in that conversation. We have since began to engage a little more directly with some corporate historians, and as well as trying to reach out to directly to the companies that are engaging in the current space industry. So what is it about now? And we in the presentation previously, we started to get into this a little bit. What's changed and why is this effort important right now? And it's a good problem to have that the space industry is so vibrant and robust at the moment. But 20th century space was very monolithic. It was primarily government run. NASA and the Air Force were really the 2 players in the United States that were engaging in space activity. And as government institutions, they were bound by record-keeping requirements. And so there were rules and laws in place to make sure that the material from the Apollo program and from these space programs, that they were documented and that they made their way eventually into the National Archives, to the National Air and Space Museum, and to NASA history offices, or to Air Force and Service history offices. And so there was, even though it still took a deliberate effort, there was a process in place for making sure at least a good portion of that history was preserved. There may not have been budget for it, but there were at least people making sure that it was happening. Today, that's shifted a bit, and the government space programs are still there, obviously, but the program's space is becoming increasingly diverse, and there's a lot more corporate players that are engaged in private spaceflight for private interests, and it's becoming increasingly entrepreneurial and commercial, and really taking a lot of its cues from the startup movement that was previously associated with Silicon Valley and tech startups. And so startup culture is very lean, it's very agile, there are small teams working very quickly, it's venture capital funded, and so all of these things have an impact on their ability or their interest in preserving their history. And so there's no external requirement for them necessarily, unless they're working on government contracts, to document this. And in some ways, I've also had conversations and heard stories that documentation is seen as anathema to this startup culture. I've heard described as sort of a garage mentality, that if a test fails, well, it was a failure, there's no need to document it. It's not really a good learn from it, let's just do something new. And so you run into these challenges of there are no robust records of what is going on at some of these companies. Compounding these challenges are the changes in how we do business today, not just in the space industry, but just in general. We were just talking about Mr. Miller's preservation of his own images, and the advance of digital technology is really challenging this. Digital tools are incredible for access, but they're very tough to archive. And we're starting to deal with an overwhelming amount of data coming in and just figuring out how to sift through it and how to capture it and organize it so that it is accessible in a meaningful way is a major challenge. And this is also compounded by the growth of decentralized media, the rise of social media and platforms like YouTube that are becoming places for the reporting on space history and what is happening in space, presents challenges of quality control and the sort of journalistic integrity isn't quite the right word, but knowing that the information that you're getting, journalistic accuracy, I suppose, is the challenge. And there also, with this decentralization, it opens an opportunity for companies to really engage in gatekeeping. So if you were trying to approach a story from a neutral standpoint or from a sort of a nuanced and complex standpoint, if you say something that this company doesn't like, they can ban you on Twitter. They can block access to the news as it's being made through these new platforms. And so that's creating a number of challenges for the historian who might not be wanting to act as necessarily a promoter for this company or any particular story, but is trying to capture what is really going on. And so this combination of shifts in the industry and shifts in how we do business is really what is driving our efforts right now to try to wrap our heads around this and come up with a way to ensure the robustness of the historic record when it comes to the next 50 years of spaceflight. So in order to really ensure that historiography, we need to make sure that we are engaged in a very deliberate, collaborative, and flexible process that involves historians like ourselves, cultural preservation organizations, as well as industry and government, in order to make sure that the historic record of the next 50 years is at least as robust as that of the Apollo program and the first 50 years of human spaceflight. So what we have done over the past several years is engaged in a very deliberate effort to reach out to companies that are working in space today and have started to suss out some of the criteria for effective engagement with, in particular, new space companies. And one of the things that we found is that a direct connection is really the most effective way to go. The most productive conversations I have had have been in sort of one-on-one with representatives from various companies to talk to them about what they're doing and to get them in that mindset. And really getting them in that mindset comes down to appealing to their legacy. We heard Mr. Miller mention that a lot of these companies believe they are making history. And so when I go out to space conferences, if I'm either speaking or asking questions, I'll ask for a show of hands from the companies of how many of the representatives there think the work they are doing is historically significant. And then my follow-up question is, okay, how many of your companies are doing something to make sure that the work you are doing is being preserved? And by making them, or getting them in to recognize that, oh, if we think we're doing something historically significant, that history doesn't make itself, and it doesn't preserve itself. We need to make sure that 50 years from now, when our company is celebrating its 50th anniversary, that we actually have the materials that we will want to inevitably display in order to capture that moment. And the other angle is really something that museums are in a unique place to take advantage of, and that is the dual mission of preservation and communication. The space industry right now is not particularly naturally inclined towards preservation, but they are very concerned about communication. A lot of the industry conferences at some point will break into sort of a kvetch session about their challenges of communicating outside of the industry bubble. And so being a representative of a museum at a space conference, when this happens, we are in a unique position to be able to help them with that in order to communicate what they are doing to the general public. They're great at communicating with their customers, they're great at communicating within the industry, but they are constantly frustrated by the lack of public understanding of what they're doing. And so if we can approach them from a communication standpoint, it can open doors to preservation. The other key that we have discovered in terms of engaging with them is to engage with regional advocacy groups and with local commerce departments. In the Puget Sound region in Washington State, there is a lot of interest in building the workforce pipeline around the space industry. We've got a lot of space companies that are starting up in our region. And so there are groups in various outlying communities, including Redmond, which is where Aerojet Rocketdyne's in-space propulsion division is located. It's where SpaceX has their Starlink offices, and there are a number of other small startups getting rolling. They have recently launched an initiative called the Redmond Space Sector, where they are trying to get the word out that, hey, if you are a space company, come bring your business to Redmond. Similarly, Kent, Washington, which is where Boeing has had a lot of its space work going on since the 60s, and where the lunar rovers were assembled, for example, and where the lunar orbiters of the Apollo program were tested and before flight, they have been trying to talk up their space legacy in a similar fashion. And so reaching out to these groups is a great opening to then get connected with the space companies in their communities, because they are very interested in showcasing the work that is going on in their regions. So on the museum side, we also need to have our own sort of institutional readiness in order. And a couple of things that we are undertaking at the Museum of Flight, we've recently begun a concerted effort to do a technical assessment of our own ability to handle our digital infrastructure. And so we are working towards a digital mission statement, which will supplement the museum's own overall mission. And we're working with a consulting group called Lyricist, which has come in to take a look at, okay, what does our IT infrastructure look like? What does our data consumption and the growth of our data storage look like? And who is using our various assets, and how do we get those organized so that we're not tripping on each other's toes? How do files from our exhibit development wind up getting preserved for future maintenance? How do our images from our photography archives get processed and made accessible to the general public, accessible to other parts of the museum? And then just in general, how do we begin to deal with born digital assets that may be coming in? Because right now we're great at handling materials that come in physical media like film and getting those digitized. But when something comes in that began in a purely digital format, we don't have a formal process just yet. So by getting that in order, we're hoping that it will help us to engage better with some of these companies. Also, one of the things that we find when we're reaching out to companies is that especially smaller startups are incredibly concerned about ITAR and export control. If you talk to longtime government contractors, they're like, it's not that big a deal. We have a compliance officer, they can help handle it. But small companies are incredibly concerned because it creates a sort of an administrative burden for them. So they might be hesitant to donate something or to share material that has export control restrictions. And so making sure that we as a museum have our own processes in place is something that really helps to smooth over those conversations and help them to engage with us with confidence. We've also found that beginning engagement in a non-exhibit or non-material way is sort of an easy lift and a way to capture some of those stories that doesn't necessarily require them to hand over hardware or otherwise share things that they might not quite be ready to let go of. So we have begun bringing in companies to give talks at the museum, and we record those talks, and so those become part of the record that the museum has. We also have been doing oral histories with folks from the industry, or engaging in social media outreach efforts. So podcasts, AMAs online, YouTube recordings, that sort of thing. And that has been incredibly helpful. One other challenge that museums and other historic institutions face when dealing with the sort of new space environment is this sort of buyer beware scenario that's arising that is born a lot out of kind of a much more dynamic and not necessarily stable environment. And a lot of this chalks up to those contemporary business practices and startup business practices. Because again, you have venture capital funding that is now making its way into the industry. And that means that paper rocket companies have been around for a long time where someone's working on a project and it never quite pans out. But it feels like that is becoming much more of a challenge where companies that seem to be doing really well, take Virgin Orbit for example, where they're building rockets, they're launching rockets, but then they just collapse for lack of funding. And this mix of government program funding providing just a little bit of the support, but then needing to find that other business case is making for a much less stable environment. And some companies, the goal may not actually be to build a viable long-term product. The goal may be to present yourself as attractive enough and get sold to a Maxar or to a Northrop Grumman or to one of these major players and get absorbed and create a financial exit for those early investors. And so in trying to figure out how we approach the storytelling around this history, we as cultural historians have to navigate the sort of different mindsets and try to have some sort of savviness towards the business end of things and what may actually be the motivation, even if it is not openly stated. So to boldly preserve process, over the course of the pandemic, we continued to meet and continued to engage in these efforts. And one of the big things that we did was we stood up a website called toboldlypreserve.space. And this is intended to be a toolkit at the moment for kind of a first step for industry who may be interested in preserving their own history. Because when we were reaching out, one of the number one questions we got asked was, well, what can we do about it? what should we be preserving? How do we go about doing this? And so we set up a website to start answering these questions, and it includes, currently it's fairly minimal, it includes sort of an FAQ for organizations that may be interested in doing better to preserve their own history. It includes link lists to members of To Boldly Preserve who they can reach out to directly if they wish to get more direct feedback or input. And it also includes links to the various papers and articles and things that we have begun to generate in support of this effort. So we're hoping to grow that now that we are emerging from the pandemic and are looking for ways to build out a more robust infrastructure. And Jonathan will talk more about that later this afternoon. So that is the end of my presentation. So if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer.